Hi everyone, and welcome to another little short video clip for Bounce Lab, our think tank for imagining a digitally enabled and data-driven economic recovery in response to, of course, the challenging times that we've been experiencing. My name is Adam Beck. I'm Executive Director of the Smart Cities Council for Australia and New Zealand, and also curator of Bounce Lab. And with me today as a guest is Ross Elliott. Ross, thanks so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks for having me along.
Ross, let's start with the quick bio. Who are you and what do you do?
Okay, I'm Regional General Manager for Property and Infrastructure Consultants, APP. In addition to that, I chair the Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Initiative, I chair the local district council of the Urban Land Institute, and I've been involved for some time with an organisation called the Suburban Alliance, which I helped set up and run 2 or 3 years ago. And a few other things, but that'll do for now, I think, Adam.
It will, and it's your long time passion and advocacy around life in our suburbs, which is why I've sort of dragged you onto this somewhat unscripted impromptu video interview. I'd really like to sort of unpack a couple of ideas and thoughts that might be floating around in your head, some that are in mind, and we'll sort of see where that lands. First of all, I live out in a suburb in northern Brisbane, proud suburbanite. I've never seen the suburbs so alive in such a really challenging time. I've been observing a lot of vibrancy, as probably you have as well, and you know, many who are watching this video, dogs, bikes, runners, exercisers. We've all got to know 2 or 3 more little local traders a bit better. I think we've got a new relationship with our food as well. If it's a coffee shop and it's in the suburbs, some of them are doing very busy right now. What are you generally observing out there in the burbs, and have been over the last sort of couple of months? It's been now since we've had the lockdowns.
Well, I think it's very mixed, Adam, and we've got to be careful of not falling into some sort of trap of cognitive bias where, you know, we look for the things that confirm our suspicions. There are a lot more people, obviously, in the suburbs who, because they're required to work from home, are making much more use of the local amenities. But let's not also forget that the employment impact in particular for people in suburban jobs has probably been more profound. A lot of those jobs are not, like, they cannot work from home. They're just not that sort of occupation. So, you know, it's not the case that the majority of the workforce to begin with were office workers in CBD buildings and we've all gone to work in the suburbs and now we're all happily walking our dog and having coffee. Some of that is going on, but not for the majority. So I suppose I can see a great sort of a sense of awakening of realising that we've got these assets, these suburban villages and these suburban parks, and a lot more people are using them. So that's a very big positive. The concern I have is that we don't, as I said before, we don't make the presumption that no one's hurting out there, because I think the pain, my suspicion is that the pain in some of these suburban-based industries has been far more profound. And those people, they're probably just sitting at home because they've got no money to go out and buy coffee.
I spent sort of March or thereabouts trying to just listen, you know, and I spent a lot of time on calls and small group gatherings with cities who are our primary audience at the Smart Cities Council. One thing, I mean, and as we've known and as we know, you know, small business is the engine room of the economy here in Australia, but also, of course, in other places around the world. One thing that was quite evident quite early was cities did not have a grasp on or data that could help them understand who was surviving and who wasn't, right? So there seemed to be this one data set that every city wanted or wants, which is how many small businesses were impacted, were closed down today, and where were they? And that data set didn't exist. So one thing is this relationship between local government and small business, and for me, it's opened up some really big cracks in terms of any sense of real timeness. Okay, so if a small business shuts down in the suburbs, kind of you might eventually find out, if paperwork files through the relevant processes. So the relationship between the city and small business for me, I think, is one area where we've got to look closely at it, and that indeed may help sort of ignite a different relationship in the future, building it in a more resilient way, so that
Yeah,
we've got a sense of what is going on out there. Has there been for you any particular observations around the relationship between local government and small business?
um, no, because as a general rule, I guess my answer to that would be we have tended in Australia, right across all of our cities, to confuse the term city with
Yeah.
just the inner city. And we
Mm.
haven't thought about the city as being a broader metropolitan network of people, housing, jobs, industry, transport, all interconnected. Um, my criticism has been for a long time that even though the statistics from the census will tell us that whether it's Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, or whatever, between 8 and 9 out of 10 of all jobs in that metropolitan area called the city are suburban jobs. So people wake up from a suburban bed in a suburban home and largely go to a suburban place of work every day of the week. And yet we've become transfixed by the inner city. And that's where we focus most of our attention, most of our policy, our research, increasingly, the criticism that this is a bubble or a goat cheese curtain of influence, because this is where all of the professionals, the lawyers, the media, the politicians, the commentators, the cognoscenti live and circulate in that market. So we've allowed a level of detachment, and I don't think this is just a local government issue. I think it's very much a state government issue. And potentially also a federal government issue, a level of detachment between what's actually going on in these broader metropolitan areas. We don't understand what 8 out of 10 of those jobs are, what their needs are, and we make a lot of presumptions. So this event, I guess, has turned that spotlight back onto those places. I'm hoping that what we start to see is a spotlight turned onto what their needs and opportunities are, because for 30 years, the focus on the inner city has delivered some fantastic outcomes, and you couldn't say that Australian cities are not, inner cities are not better for it. There's some marvellous examples of public investment leading private investment on a scale that, if you'd gone back to Better Cities area, we never would have imagined. New Farm, back in the early 90s, New Farm was equivalent to 8 Mile Plains in its median house price. So to keep that in context, it is now the most expensive suburb in all of Queensland. So there's been a marked shift. But in that time, we haven't spent the same amount of energy on some of our suburban centres. But we've got the lessons now, right? They're all in the back pocket. We've got the playbooks there. We know what needs to be done: infrastructure, placemaking, business attraction, just basic issues of amenity. If we applied that to, say, someone like Chermside, how good could that be? And that's what I hope we start to now realise. It's much more than just some sort of suburban putsch. It's a real genuine opportunity to create a more resilient economy, because if we have multiple nodes around the city, we don't have all our eggs in one basket. I just think back it's not just the virus. We had a flood here only a few years ago, and that basically shut down the entire CBD, and there were no sort of plan B business centres. So lots of opportunity, Adam, lots of opportunity. To answer your question, I think it wasn't just local government. I think governments at all levels got detached from that reality that the city is a much bigger thing than just the 3-kilometre ring. And it's far more important that we focus on, the 8 out of 10 than just the 2 out of
10. Can I, when I use the word density in this conversation in the context of this pandemic, I've observed some interesting commentary around that.
You're poking the bear.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I suspect you have as well. Is there anything in that? Is it worth even giving it any airtime? You know, the sort of the potential or so-called sort of risk of greater density, you know, being sort of more of an incubator for, you know, for these viruses and other things. I mean, do you play into that? What are your observations there?
Look, one I think it's far too early to say, but it's human behaviour that's going to be the deciding factor in this. So the question, I mean, New York is already very concerned about what the future use of its subway system is going to be, and they are. Without a subway system, you don't have Manhattan. I mean, they're sunk without it.
Mm.
So the question becomes, you know, how many people, when it's all green lights back to work, are going to feel comfortable standing shoulder to shoulder, highly packed, with a bunch of sneezing, coughing fellow passengers? Now, I don't know.
Yeah.
We're not New York, right? And we've never had that level of density, except on maybe a couple of Gold Coast services, reportedly, on some trains. Most of our public transit's only been 15% of journey to work. Most of that's been on buses. What's the reaction going to be by public transport authorities? Are they going to permanently introduce some sort of distancing into public transport, for example? That'll mean fewer passengers per bus or train. That's going to mean either more services or less people catching it. I don't know. So that issue around density is going to very much be driven by people's attitudes and also authorities. Workforce density in offices. I think, you know, we were beginning to see 8 square metres per person as a design norm for new premises, particularly for large, you know, paper factory. That's gone. I mean, I cannot see how that will remain acceptable for a whole range of workers, the unions, or for a number of employers. So will they need to expand their floor space requirements to allow for more space per person, or will they simply say, we're going to have fewer people working in this city office, and some of you can decamp to suburban collaboration hubs or something like that? More speculation, but it's not going to be driven by some academics and planners and architects taking shots at density or defending density. It's going to be the behavioural patterns of people who, you know, this has affected. We've been terrified out of our skins on this one, and I don't think a lot of people are going to come back to work feeling exactly the same about proximity. You know, they're just going to feel uncomfortable for a while.
Yeah,
maybe forever. I don't know.
Yeah. I was on a virtual forum of planning nerds. I'm a fellow planner from way back. Couple of weeks ago, and it was just all about planning. The conversation. There was some very interesting sort of little rabbit holes we went down to, and it was across Australia and New Zealand. And in New Zealand, there was a fascinating conversation going on around development approvals, community engagement, you know, potential projects sort of slipping through the cracks where, you know, you can't really come together face to face and do engagement and hearings and all that kind of stuff. There was a moment in time during that conversation, more broadly, where someone just said, hang on, what does land use planning look like after COVID-19, or sort of on the way out of COVID-19? And I try and ponder that question in the context of sort of, you know, Brisbane and Southeast Queensland, where we're based. My question to you, Ross, is, you know, and if we just talk about Brisbane for a moment, it's kind of gone for sort of, you know, nodes, spoke, CBD in the middle, classic kind of arrangement. If you had the magic wand and you had to sort of, you know, paint or sorry, not a magic wand, you know, a paintbrush, and you had to paint sort of, you know, a high level strategic sort of land use plan for our sort of region, big city that we've got here, broader metro, Brisbane. Does it change much?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Look, my criticism of the SEQ regional plan has always been that the heavy lifting in terms of growth, which was typically around your Bayside, Logan Bow Desert, Ipswich, Moreton Bay North, Moreton Bay South, around the periphery. That was being asked to tackle most of the population growth. And yet most of the emphasis on employment growth was always around the core. Now, what we've done just recently, which is very interesting, is to look at state budgets going back 8 years, back to when Premier Beattie, I think, started to release regional breakup. That was to keep the Hansonites happy. Ironically, what that's done, though, over 8 years of expenditure, it's shown that the inner city, the investment in the inner city is 8 times, roughly, or more in total terms and in per capita terms as to what, say, Logan Bay Desert are receiving, or Redlands is receiving, or Moreton Bay North or Moreton Bay South. So the SEQ regional plan is saying, you take we'll put all of the people, the growth, into your areas, but we'll spend all of the improvement money in the inner city. Now that's inequitable. It's very unfair. It doesn't create a level playing field in terms of employment opportunity, nor does it spread the infrastructure load very well across the place. So if I had that magic wand, Adam, that's the curve I would flatten, right? It would be the expenditure curve to more fairly understand the pressures of growth in some of these areas, and also understand that they're not dormitories. People aren't going to live in these areas and commute all the way to the inner city. About 10% of the people that say a North Lakes or a Springfield will be commuting to work in the inner city. The other 90% are working either locally or in adjoining areas or elsewhere in Queensland. So what's our plan to support those industries and those jobs and provide them with the infrastructure that makes them an appealing place to go? I go back to the Chermside example again. I understand the tax office after many years of moving out. They're moving out of Chermside and coming back to the city. Well, for the people who have for many years, maybe lived at Everton Park or Stafford and commuted to Chermside, their journey is now longer, more expensive, and for what gain? You can't criticise the tax office, though, if that's been their decision, because Chermside at the moment is not terribly attractive. Apart from the shopping centre, where Westfield has spent a lot of money, there's been very little else spent on making that place attractive. So given the question, where would you rather be, A or B? At the moment, it's been B. But as I said, my answer to that would be that the SEQ plan has always been quite distorted. It has never reconciled infrastructure spending with the patterns of growth. The focus has mainly been on housing, not so much on jobs. And I think, if you could do anything, I would start again, literally with almost a blank piece of paper on the SEQ regional plan, recognising that things have changed forever, and that if we want to build a much more economically resilient region with shorter commutes and actually do something about enhancing quality of life, following the patterns of the last 10 years or so is not going to get us there.
Yeah. Can I throw into the mix there e-commerce? Okay, we've seen some pretty phenomenal numbers over the last 3 years. Australia is up there, like in the top 3 or 4. The last numbers I looked at, it's kind of like, I think it's like somewhere between 15-20% growth year on year in terms of our online purchases. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly amped that up in a couple of areas. There's one in particular at a micro scale which is quite fascinating watching right now, which is sort of food delivery. Right, I'm currently in our office here at Newmarket. And I'm backing onto sort of little Newmarket village here, and when I sort of pop around to get some lunch from the local Coles here, I think it was the other day, I counted 24 push bikes who were owned by the guys and girls that put the food in the backpack and sort of ride it up to someone's front door, right? So there's this very interesting, and of course that was around before COVID-19, but it has certainly accelerated that. So what do we got here? We've got an issue around lifestyle, right? We've got one of these. So 2 taps of the screen, and we've got sort of a chicken katsu curry in our lap at home, still in the pajamas. What if anything changes, accelerates, decrease around this idea of lifestyle, ordering online, and these are suburban areas where, we've got this acceleration of a particular service, thanks or otherwise to sort of, technology. What are you sort of thinking in that space?
Well, in my experience, when you look back over history, many times the impact of technology has been grossly exaggerated on our lives. Our local village is very happily populated by Deliveroo riders on pushies or little scooters as well. Now, they were there before, they'll be there after this thing as well. I'm more hopeful that the human instinct to want to congregate and socialise will mean that when those restaurants reopen and can have people dining in, that I will, for one anyway, be wanting to explore that experience rather than just what's on the plate. Right? Because as you know, the restaurants that often do well have their own atmosphere and their own sort of sensory qualities, that it's more than just the food. It's the service you get, it's the atmosphere, the decor, all of those things. So I think that will come back. On the bigger side of things with online and retail, clearly people have become very used to shopping online, and that's accelerated. This COVID thing has accelerated that trend. I don't think it's the end of shopping centres because we've been through those predictions before, but there are fundamental changes coming, no doubt. They are, thanks to our highly anti-competitive planning laws, they are particularly well located without much competition around them, right?
Yeah,
so if you just look at it as a piece of land, as a piece of commercially zoned land, very typically excellent transport connections, often public transport serviced, very large sites, ample parking, little competition. So what's happening is we've seen the demise of large format retail, or some types of large format retail have struggled, fashion in particular. But I think you're going to see health and allied health uses, education and other community uses find their way into these centres. So the market's going to work that out over time. People will still want to congregate. They're convenient places to go. Whether they'll just be pure retail as we used to understand it, or whether they'll morph into something quite different, I don't know. But I'm not, for one, predicting the end of it. I think we're seeing a very unusual spike forced by this, so-called lockdown or isolation, and that things won't go back to the way they were before, but they'll return slightly and find a midway point.
Yeah. I want to talk our vulnerable populations in our communities. I want to talk about compassion for a moment. I think my observation is I think there's been a heightened level of compassion and understanding and recognition that our most vulnerable populations, particularly our elderly, are really important, and it took a global pandemic for us to kind of open the shops an hour early and give them some space and time so they can move through. Do you, sorry, and before I ask the question, the other one that is interesting is, I don't know if you've ever caught a bus, in the middle of the day. For some reason, I was on a bus from Stafford into the city one day at like noon, where sort of the worker population is sort of at work, and the bus is filled with people with walkers, single mum with children, people, those most vulnerable who fundamentally rely on public transport. That it's really sort of obvious. I have noticed from time to time during the pandemic and lockdown, a couple of elderly people who obviously have had to go out and for whatever reason can't sort of grab a cab or an Uber. And you can tell they're just sort of fearing for their lives, distancing and obviously sort of underpinning health conditions and things like that. Talk to me about the elderly, the vulnerable, our neighbourhoods and suburbs, and sort of does everything just go away again and back to normal, or is there something there maybe that sort of sticks with us and we really sort of acknowledge now? Is there anything in that for you?
Well, along with sort of my love of suburban renewal, you might know one of my other passions has been seniors housing. And my view on the whole issue of seniors housing is that it's been driven largely by the very, if you measure the pyramid, it's been driven by the interests of the very, very apex of that pyramid. People who can afford $700,000 to move into a seniors housing project at Newstead. I've got no problem with that. It's wonderful. But most seniors cannot afford that. And when I've looked into the actual financial position of seniors in Australia, it's not flash. So, the average senior pension reliant, they're on very tight incomes, and we don't offer much in the way of housing choice for them either. Going to the sort of high-end retirement living model or the high-end aged care model, it's just unaffordable for many.
Yeah.
And we haven't really solved that issue. Now, I don't know what the answer is. I think there are some things that we can do in terms of land use to create smaller single dwellings, which is what they want, preferably in their local community, but perhaps without changing the land title. So I've had some conversations with a number of planners and developers around that, and hopefully that provides a stopgap measure. But we're just a society, Adam, that hasn't, we like family. We celebrate much of the sort of young to middle age end of it. Seniors tend to, they go off, or we move away. We're not like a lot of Asian cultures that embrace the whole seniors thing into the family terribly well. That's just an observation. And because we are living longer, it's going to get even harder. We are living well beyond sort of what would have been possible 30, 40 years ago. And even my own mother, who's in a nursing home with dementia, 30 or 40, if this was 30 or 40 years ago, she probably wouldn't be alive.
Yeah.
But in her case, she's got no quality of life. But it's a very difficult subject. And it's not really it's not all of the planning issue. It's just a whole of society issue about how we reach out and make sure we stay connected to seniors and understand their needs. As you said, the bus incident, being terrified of stepping outside, you can understand why they'd be worried.
Do you think there's a greater appreciation now? Has this pandemic given us a greater appreciation?
Temporarily, yeah. But is it going to last? I don't know.
Yeah.
You'd hope so, but
yeah.
The volunteers who are out there going to visit the oldies at the moment, I think that's fantastic. When this thing's over, and it will be one day, is that going to hang around to the extent? Well, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, final question. Let's talk optimism and the future. Can you give me a sense of what's kind of potentially exciting you for the rest of 2020, if I can ask that?
I'm very hopeful. It's what you started with. I'm just very hopeful that what to me has been a fairly anti-suburban mindset amongst some, right, in urban planning circles, the Elizabeth Farrellys of the world who've just disdained suburbs as a wasteland. I hope that's going to turn around now, because it's quite obvious, as you said, that people are out and enjoying their suburban environments. It's becoming quite obvious how many people work in those environments, and hopefully, as we begin to think a bit more about it, we'll start to identify the opportunities in those places. I mean, we've got, in this city, crazily enough, we've got level crossings all over the place. Now, they date back to the early 1900s, Adam. I mean, this is just ridiculous. I mean, do we need someone walking in front of cars with a red flag and a bell or something? I mean, it's just time has moved on. Surely, this is time we fix. The first thing you do is fix up some of this absolutely antiquated nonsense. These level crossings holding up traffic and trains, for a long time. So there's a lot that can be done. It was hard to justify in the past. I think governments, if you wanted to spend $100 million, say, in a suburban area, they might have felt that, that's a bit hard to justify. The business case for spending $100 million in the inner city, though, didn't require justification. You announced it. 50 million on a bikeway here, some many millions on something over there, not a problem. But to justify the same thing in the suburbs was harder. Hopefully, in the future, it'll be the same test. The same benefit economic benefit and social and community benefit tests, whether it's a suburban project or one for the inner city. That's what I would hope.
Well, fantastic insights, Ross. Look forward to sort of comparing notes in maybe a couple of other months to see how the transition goes. I mean, so many question marks still remain. But for now, thanks so much for joining us in the Bounce Club. It's been great to have you. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam.